Good morning, everyone. My name is Ryan, and I'm a volunteer with IPAC. So before we begin, just a gentle reminder that all sessions will be recorded, and we ask that you please keep your videos and microphones off during the session. And if you have a question, just please raise your hand using the raise hand function in Zoom or type it in the chat. So today I'll be introducing Gina, Georgia, Henry, and Dr. Miles. So Gina is a fifth-year kinesiology student in the interdisciplinary stream at UBC. She's passionate in improving the health and wellness of everyone by bringing awareness to equitable opportunities and cultural safety into sports and recreation programs. Gina enjoys dancing, cycling, hiking, and canoeing in her spare time. Georgia is a first-year kinesiology student, particularly interested in becoming a registered dietitian. She has previously worked at a mental health clubhouse in the heart of downtown Langley and is passionate about equal opportunities in accessing mental health resources. She enjoys jogging, cycling, and reading in her spare time. And Henry is a former graduate student and trainee in the ISK, or Indigenous Studies in Kinesiology program at UBC. Currently, Henry serves on the board of directors for the Health and Fitness Society of BC and works for the UBC Wellness Center as a health promotion specialist. Henry enjoys acrylic painting, kayaking, and gardening in his spare time. And last but not least, Dr. Rosalin Miles is a member of Lytton First Nation, and Dr. Miles has a combined 35 years of experience in the sports and fitness, education, and health fields as a Division I level, NCAA level coach, registered kinesiologist, active release therapist, university instructor, researcher, awarded certified strength and conditioning specialist, and a national level athlete. She currently works with the University of British Columbia within the Indigenous Studies in Kinesiology department. And today, Gina, Georgia, Henry, and Dr. Miles will be speaking on cultural humility in Indigenous physical activity knowledge translation. So whenever you're ready, take it away.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gina Gavin, and I go by the pronouns she, her, and I have ancestry from South Korea, Scotland, Finland, and Sweden. I'm so honored to kick off today's presentation with Georgia, Henry, and Dr. Rosalin Miles. I'm currently here speaking from Vancouver, which is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam peoples. Today, we will address the topics of cultural humility and knowledge translation, and how these concepts come together when we think about how we can promote physical activity participation in culturally safe ways. So even though this is a Zoom call, we try our best to make it as engaging and interactive as possible. So I just wanted to let you all know that there is also a chat feature where you can ask questions and a moderator will be doing their best at answering them. At the end of our presentation, we will also save some time to address any other burning questions. Without further ado, let's get this presentation started. Now, I want to bring your attention to the colonial definition of knowledge translation, according to the Canadian Institute of Health Research. So the CIHR states that knowledge translation is the dynamic and iterative process that includes synthesis, dissemination, exchange, and ethically sound application of knowledge. But we should now ask, is this definition culturally safe and inclusive of Indigenous culture and Indigenous peoples? First off, according to Dr. Warburton and Dr. Braden's systematic study back in 2021, they found that there's currently a huge lack of culturally sensitive physical activity guidelines and recommendations that address Indigenous perspectives. So as a result, you can see how this can be, in fact, quite harmful in so many different ways to Indigenous people, because now there's this gap in how information is presented and promoted to these communities. And so because of this gap, physical activity guidelines become less achievable and so less effective, which is the problem that we're facing. So then how can we decolonize knowledge translation and make it a more inclusive and culturally safe framework? And also, I'd like to add, how can we do all of this specifically when we are trying to figure out different ways to promote physical activity in Indigenous communities? Well, one very valuable way we can do this, and this is something that really stuck with me because of how much it was emphasized in my UBC Indigenous Studies seminar courses, is to actually incorporate Indigenous perspectives of health and wellness through the process of co-creation. Now, co-creation has so much great potential and power to serve the communities because it is a strength-based and Indigenous-led process in which collaborative knowledge generation is achieved by academics working alongside other stakeholders, which would most likely be like an Indigenous knowledge keeper, for example, or other Indigenous community members. So, in other words, the co-creation process is what really creates this culturally safe environment for Indigenous people to speak out openly about their community's aspirations regarding physical activity related guidelines without having this fear of judgment from others and without the fear of being discriminated against or the fear of facing racist comments and actions. So now I want to bring your attention to my next question. What would a more inclusive and culturally safe framework for Indigenous knowledge translation kind of look like? Well, first off the bat, currently there is no framework that is dedicated solely towards Indigenous physical activity and lifestyle. And so my colleagues and I were thinking, perhaps we should be aiming towards developing a decolonized knowledge translation framework that is Indigenous-led and based on traditional Indigenous knowledge and ways of living. So we kind of came up with the idea of an Indigenous physical activity knowledge translation model. Basically, what we would hope for is that this model is there to support and empower the Indigenous communities with the purpose to inspire Indigenous people to be able to take part in their own lifelong journey of regular physical activity. But one thing that I truly believe to be super important is that they are engaging in activities that are relevant and practical to their everyday life. And so that they are doing the things that allow them to connect with their culture and connect more with their community as a whole and their own self-identity. Now, this may make you wonder, how can we be facilitators in the co-creation of this Indigenous designed model? So first of all, we need to actually understand how to express cultural humility and how to incorporate the components of the continuum of care into our everyday practice. Okay, so before we answer those questions, I need to explain what is cultural humility and the continuum of care. So cultural humility is a lifelong journey of self-reflection and assessment of your own awareness, knowledge, and appreciation for the different cultures around the world we live in. And the continuum of care is a self-learning journey that involves a few steps. So first, what happens is that we need to reach some level of cultural awareness before we are even able to know what and how cultural sensitivity works. And after establishing this kind of base knowledge, we can then learn to actually embody the essence of cultural safety into our everyday interactions. So now I'm just going to briefly explain to you all what each of these terms mean. We will start with cultural awareness. So this is where you are self-aware of your own personal background and history, of the power imbalances that exist in the world you live in, and also just being aware that there are diverse backgrounds, cultures, and histories to each and every individual. Cultural sensitivity is when you explore and deepen your knowledge of these cultural differences, and then realize and understand that we all have our implicit biases, which influence the way we view other cultures and the way we treat others. Now, cultural safety is also a pretty broad term, but it's definitely a very important one. This encompasses behaving and interacting with people in a way that is free from discrimination, isolation, and racism. It also means being respectful of the different perspectives and cultures that exist around you by simply just encouraging each other in ways that would empower one another, as well as bring about pride and self-confidence in each other's identities. When talking specifically within the context of Indigenous peoples, promoting decolonization and redressing the historical harms is something to strongly consider because it is all super crucial parts to the self-learning journey of becoming a more culturally safe facilitator and ally to the Indigenous peoples and communities. So this now brings us to our next question. Why is it so important to establish cultural humility and cultural safety into the Indigenous physical activity knowledge translation framework? So ultimately, it is to honor, embrace, and respect the diverse Indigenous cultures and people from all over the world, and to help these communities feel empowered to live a life that is inspired by their traditional holistic Indigenous roots and their ways of living. This is why I think it is so important to know how to express cultural humility and cultural safety in an honest way. So this is why I've gathered a few key points to keep in mind when trying to learn how to become more culturally safe. So first, we need to ensure that we respect all nationalities, cultures, age, sex, gender, and political, religious, and traditional beliefs. We need to establish trust with the Indigenous community. We need to empower the Indigenous peoples by reinforcing and validating their knowledges, values, and traditions. And finally, but certainly not the least, we need to facilitate a safe environment that encourages open communication. Now, to kind of sum up what I've discussed so far, I would like to show you all a short animation clip I created, which talks a bit more about what it looks like to promote physical activity through cultural humility, while also maintaining culturally safe practices. What my goal for you to all take away from this video is that it is very important that we have culturally safe outlooks on current Indigenous ways of staying physically active, so that when physical activity guidelines are presented and promoted, these guidelines actually inspire Indigenous peoples to make even more healthy lifestyle choices and continue living the way they would like to live. So let's take a look at this video.
Hello everyone, let's talk about why cultural humility is so important for the knowledge translation framework dedicated towards Indigenous physical activity. But first, what is cultural humility? Cultural humility is the lifelong journey of self-reflection and assessment of your own awareness, knowledge, and appreciation for the different cultures. In order to attain cultural humility, first, cultural awareness needs to be achieved. This means educating yourself of the differences between cultures. Next, cultural sensitivity needs to be established. This means realizing that implicit biases exist and understanding what they are. As a result, cultural competency can be attained. This means being able to effectively and respectively interact with people from different cultures. This can all be expressed through cultural humility. Now, what is knowledge translation? Well, it is the dynamic and iterative process that includes synthesis, dissemination, exchange, and ethically sound application of knowledge. So how do we show cultural humility in Indigenous physical activity knowledge translation? First thing is to become culturally competent in Indigenous culture and to embrace and implement the co-creation process. This is where academics collaborate with Indigenous communities to create joined knowledges. Therefore, to co-create culturally sensitive physical activity recommendations for Indigenous communities, we need to first respect, honor, and acknowledge the traditional, historical, and cultural worldviews and the aspirations of the Indigenous peoples. Thank you all for listening. I hope these messages resonate well with you all.
So I hope this video helped solidify some of the concepts I just talked about and gave you a bit of a fun visual representation. Now, I just wanted to briefly touch on a few other ways we can express cultural humility when promoting physical activity in different Indigenous communities. First of all, it can be as simple as encouraging all Indigenous peoples, whether they are children, youth, adults, or older adults, from all the different communities to partake in their own traditional sports. Or maybe it's a traditional game, or perhaps it is even a traditional activity that just requires you to move your body and get active, like hunting, fishing, dancing, or even seasonal berry picking. So when we encourage these types of activities that are already embedded within their lifestyle and culture, we are actually engaging in some effective and culturally safe ways to promote the engagement in lifelong physical activity. Another thing I wanted to point out was that we can help cultivate a very positive environment that stimulates a self-driven motivation and desire to participate in regular physical activity by allowing this freedom and flexibility to participate in whatever traditional activity as they wish. And the reason is because it is so closely integrated into their traditional Indigenous lifestyle, which in turn brings them closer to their culture, their land, and their community. And this strengthens their sense of belonging and their sense of Indigenous identity. As you can probably understand, these are all very essential components that take into account the holistic approach to traditional Indigenous health and wellness, which of course ultimately leads to living a more fulfilling and happy, balanced life. This is just a little snippet from my infographic that illustrates a few big Indigenous sports games and competitions that run yearly around North America for Indigenous athletes. For example, there is the North American Indigenous Games, as you can see to your left, the Alberta Indigenous Games, as seen at the top, and the Masters Indigenous Games, as you can see represented by the lower middle symbol. And finally, the logo for Football Canada, which is illustrated at the bottom right-hand side corner. I just wanted to quickly address the Indigenous artist, Colton Casalis Grant, who was the creator of this logo, as a way to produce some sort of national identity for football, specifically for the Indigenous communities across Canada. So every act like this, specifically in this case where we are talking about a national sports association, plays a strong role in supporting Indigenous culture, especially in our more westernized sports world. Not only that, but acts like this also gives our Indigenous athletes the space to develop a greater sense of Indigenous pride, identity, and unity. And so by doing more simple acts like this is how we can all show more cultural humility and adopt a type of behavior that is more inclusive. So this is one example of how we can learn to cultivate a more culturally safe space for the Indigenous communities and athletes. Now, I'm not quite done with the videos yet. I do have one last one to show you all. So this video is another short animation clip I created last year while working alongside Dr. Miles, Sean, and Dr. Warburton for the International Society for Physical Activity and Health's 8th annual virtual Spirit Walk Run event. The reason I wanted to bring your attention to this event is to show you a real life example that is based on the fundamentals of cultural humility, cultural safety, and the traditional Indigenous holistic knowledges of health and wellness, as well as to show you how this concept of the Indigenous physical activity knowledge translation framework can actually play an important role in guiding us into co-creating strength-based initiatives and strategies that better support Indigenous peoples to achieve their own personal physical activity goals, as well as the physical activity goals of their community. So Henry, you can start this next video.
Hello, everyone. Let's talk about the positive impacts the Spirit Walk Run event has on people from all communities. People say stay active and go outside. It's healthy. But why? Let's break it down. What is land-based physical activity? It's engaging in physical activity out in nature. Yep, it's that simple and can provide you with a ton of benefits to your health and wellness. Let's focus on 3 key messages: empowering communication, improving motivation, and strengthening relationships. When taking a strength-based approach, especially with an Indigenous-led event, clear, empowering, and positive communication is very important. Encouraging messages play a strong role in establishing community-based participation in land-based physical activity. So how do community-based activities help improve motivation? Well, engaging in land-based physical activity with the people you love and care about has a positive long-term impact on your motivation to engage in lifelong physical activity. This is because you can connect with others on a regular basis, share stories, learn from your elders, and create a sense of community. Furthermore, the more time you spend with your loved ones and the more spiritually connected you feel out in nature can strengthen the relationships in your life, whether that is with your family members, friends, Indigenous or non-Indigenous peoples and communities. This all leads to improving and balancing your physical, emotional, spiritual, and mental health. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope these key messages resonate well with you all.
I hope you all enjoyed this little video clip. So what I wanted to just reiterate again was the fact that every act counts. You don't need to do anything particularly grand to be a facilitator of Indigenous physical activity knowledge translation. It can start off as simple as just participating in an Indigenous-led active spirit walk run event or an Indigenous-led community walk. It's really all about the little things that makes a positive and powerful impact on the Indigenous communities. From what I have learned, the first step is to commit to making small but steady changes to how you view Indigenous culture and their traditional lifestyle. And this can be accomplished by educating yourself on how to decolonize our current attitudes on traditional lifestyle, as well as how to decolonize our own approach to physical activity promotion so that in the end, we are able to interact with Indigenous communities with cultural humility and cultural safety. Okay, so now before I end things off, I wanted to re-emphasize a few concluding key points. First of all, we should all aim to practice cultural humility and learn to decolonize our current attitudes that are harmful to Indigenous peoples by learning how to integrate an Indigenous physical activity knowledge translation framework. In other words, integrating cultural humility into your everyday practice does not have to be this complex and difficult task. In fact, it should not even be a task at all, but in a lifestyle approach for the equity and respect to all humans. Second, we should all engage in this lifelong journey of discovering what we can do and how we can apply the continuum of care into our everyday lives. Third, it is very important that when we collaborate with Indigenous communities, we want to make sure that we take on a strength-based Indigenous-led approach that focuses on the aspirations of their community as a whole. Last but not least, the last key point I will talk about is having the main priority be about integrating traditional Indigenous ways of living when co-creating physical activity guidelines and programs for Indigenous communities. Now, I will pass it on to Georgia.
Thank you, Gina. Hello, everyone. My name is Georgia Street. I go by the pronouns she, her, and I have ancestry from Italy, Norway, Ireland, and England. I will be building off of Gina's presentation to speak a little bit about how we can work together to decolonize the current physical activity guidelines. I want to start off by acknowledging that I am sharing knowledge today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam-speaking people. As a kinesiology student, I recognize that there is a lot of work that still needs to be done in the area of physical activity and cultural safety. Throughout my studies in the past year, I have had the opportunity to learn, relearn, and unlearn a lot of the things that have shaped my understanding of physical activity growing up. And today, I would like to share some of these things with you. As you may have heard, the Canadian Society of Exercise Physiology released the new Canadian 24-hour movement guidelines last year. A key highlight is that these guidelines promote an integrated approach, for instance, reducing sedentary activity and sleeping well, in addition to increasing movement behaviors. In fact, for the first time, the guidelines call out that light physical activity, including standing, matter too. Knowledge translation messages that encourage us to move more without focusing on the need to achieve this weekly threshold of 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity is really important. It's important because these messages resonate with more people. It's more inclusive. Here's why moving more matters, regardless of your current activity levels. Moving more is clinically relevant for individuals who are less active or live a more sedentary lifestyle. We know based on evidence that small changes in fitness can lead to significant improvements in health-related benefits. This graph illustrates this point very well. On the x-axis, we have relative fitness levels from low fitness to high fitness, and on the y-axis shows the relative risk of chronic disease. As you can see, as activity levels go up, we see a marked improvement in health-related benefits. What's important is that this improvement isn't linear, it's curvilinear, meaning that if you lived a less active lifestyle, for instance, just being a little bit more active can lead to significantly greater reduction of risk of chronic disease. In fact, the risk of reduction is about 20, and these are health-related benefits that we see from simply reducing sedentary activity time and doing light physical activity, like walking. In fact, a study conducted by Hupin and colleagues a while back showed that even a small dose of physical activity like walking can lower all-cause mortality in older adults by about 22%. So the key message here is that health benefits can be gained by adhering to physical activity guidelines well below the current recommendations. The evidence is undeniable that every little bit of activity counts, and that virtually anyone can benefit from becoming more physically active. These statements are endorsed by the position stand articulated by the American College of Sports Medicine and is supported by a systematic review of current systematic reviews, which is empirical evidence at the highest level. In fact, the evidence gathered by Doctors Warburton and Breton in this review included data from millions of participants worldwide. Again, to reiterate, health benefits can be gained by adhering to physical activity guidelines well below current recommendations. With the focus on integrating light physical activity into our lifestyle, the new guidelines are following the evidence, and they are trending in the right direction, but more work needs to be done in terms of cultural safety. However, there is very little input on how culturally safe these guidelines are when working with Indigenous communities. The guidelines mention the importance of doing physical activity in a variety of environments, for instance, within the community, but they do not elaborate further on how physical activity participation is connected to the traditional, historical, and cultural perspectives of teaching and learning valued by diverse Indigenous communities in Canada. So in reflection of the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, I took a deeper dive into how we can decolonize current Canadian physical activity guidelines to ensure that their health promotion messages respect and honor Indigenous people's views on what it means to be physically healthy. The focus must be on cultural safety rather than on disease prevention. To ensure that the guidelines are culturally safe, we need to move away from a deficits-based approach towards a strengths-based approach that focuses on the goals and aspirations of Indigenous communities and families. An example of a deficits-based approach is the use of threshold-based messaging in knowledge translation. Here's an example of a deficits-based approach. A knowledge translation message encouraging us to meet the threshold of 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity each week. The reality is that not everyone is capable of reaching or exceeding this threshold. You're asking someone to do 150 minutes of hard exercise when in reality they may have barely started. We already know that health benefits can be gained from adhering to the guidelines well below current recommendations. In fact, even doing half the recommendations can give you clinically relevant benefits. Graphically, a threshold-based message would look like this. It basically tells people that they won't gain any health benefits unless they reach 150 minutes each week, which is simply not true. So we want to move away from a deficits-based approach towards a strengths-based approach. What does a strengths-based approach look like? Well, it starts by getting rid of threshold-based messaging and focusing on how a community can grow together, one step at a time. This is because physical activity is so deeply connected to the holistic balance of mental, spiritual, and emotional well-being. And this is all achieved together as a community. Because current physical activity guidelines still focus on individual performance and still prioritize the physical aspects of well-being, like risks, diseases, and illness prevention, these guidelines must be modified for cultural safety. One way to modify for cultural safety is to use a two-eyed seeing lens. The two-eyed seeing approach involves active, respectful listening to take into consideration both the Indigenous ways of learning, of knowing, and Western perspectives. Listening twice as much as we speak is important because it allows everyone to learn about the aspirations of the community and to learn about the teaching and learning practices unique to each and every community. These are strengths-based steps that we can take to co-create culturally safe knowledge translation messages and physical activity programs in partnership with Indigenous communities. What are some examples of strengths-based approaches in the context of Indigenous physical activity knowledge translation? Henry will address this question with an example of his collaboration with IPAC through his master's research work at UBC. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Georgia, for your presentation, and Gina as well. My name is Henry Lai. Pronouns are he, him. I'm from Hong Kong and currently work and live on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I went to school at UBC and was a former trainee at Indigenous Studies and Kinesiology under the supervision of Dr. Rosalin Miles, Dr. Shannon Braden, and Dr. Darren Warburton. As a team with IPAC and many community partners, we worked in collaboration and consultation to co-create a community-based and Indigenous-led healthy living initiative in Lytton First Nation, BC. So today, I'd like to build upon Gina and George's presentation by sharing some examples of our past work and how we can take these lessons to move forward and do good with and for our communities. At the start of our timeline, we focused on building meaningful relationships with communities through knowledge translation activities held within sharing circles. Our team was then able to conduct culturally safe environmental scans to really learn more about the present day opportunities and challenges in health and wellness unique to communities in BC. In fact, some of our sharing circles were held in previous Nepal conferences. In short, we learned a lot in sharing circles, and the knowledge translation activities that were done in sharing circles helped us co-create a 3-month healthy living initiative in partnership and in friendship with Lytton First Nation. This initiative was unique in that it combined an exercise program with sharing circles. So each week after a walk-run activity, we all came together for lunch and held a sharing circle to talk about healthy living topics unique to the community. We know based on the evidence that individualized exercise programs can indeed help individuals achieve their own physical activity goals, especially at their own pace and within their own comfort zone. But we also recognize the power of community. We wanted to ensure that the initiative resonated with the teaching and learning practices that are valued by members of Lytton First Nation. And there are lots of positive outcomes from this initiative. And this includes a significant drop in sedentary activity time, particularly television, computer, and even video game screen time. So after 3 months of participation in this healthy living initiative, total screen time actually went down by a lot, from about 4.5 hours per day to about 2.5 hours per day. So the question is, where did the time go? Well, we did see a correlation between reduced screen time and actually doing more physical activity. And so based on this graph, perhaps the reduction in screen time went towards doing more movement-related activities. In fact, as you can see, as screen time goes down, participants engaged in more moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity. And this was measured using accelerometry over 7 days after the Healthy Living Initiative ended. So feel free to take a look at our publication in the Journal of Clinical Medicine for more details. Overall, this Healthy Living Initiative was a huge, huge success. And ultimately, it was successful because it was community-based and led entirely by members of the community. But there are 2 takeaways from this initiative. First, there's immeasurable importance of having sharing circles centered around elders who led the dialogue. And that health and wellness of the community is built from within, wherein everyone is a teacher and a learner. These lessons really point to the fact that a one-size-fits-all or a cookie-cutter approach is culturally unsafe when working with Indigenous communities. So when we plan community-based programming, how can we integrate evidence-based guidelines in a way that is culturally safe and respectful? Well, it starts by decolonizing how we use and communicate the evidence. And as Gina discussed, the current knowledge translation model established by CIHR is, in a way inadequate because it's not centered around the teaching and learning practices unique to Indigenous communities. Sure, we can define knowledge translation as, synthesis, exchange, dissemination, ethically sound application of knowledge. But what does this really mean when we put on a cultural safety lens? In synthesizing knowledge, we need to take careful steps to move away from deficits-based approaches and move towards perspectives that focus on strengths, aspirations, and hope, and resilience. And ultimately, this involves co-creation activities to address holistic health and well-being in the context of families and communities. Again, to further elaborate on how we co-created our Healthy Living Initiative, we invited elders to lead the dialogue on what being healthy means. During co-creation design, participants were encouraged to discuss, write, and even draw out their perceptions of health and wellness and what they were interested in sharing. And these topics include traditional Indigenous health and wellness, effects of residential schools and colonization, and holistic approaches to health and well-being. And this co-creation activity was, of course, facilitated in sharing circles. And these are safe spaces to communicate and exchange knowledge. So when we talk about knowledge exchange, we're talking about the importance of sharing circles. And one of the most important lessons that I've learned from an elder is to listen twice as much as we speak. We know what the evidence says about the health benefits of physical activity, but we can't just walk in and say, hey, this is the evidence and this is what you need to do in order to be healthy. We need to continue to be active listeners. And this was one way for us to participate in the culturally safe exchange of knowledge from different worldviews. And so we learned a lot from being active listeners. And to further learn more about what was shared in our sharing circles, we wanted to see if there were any themes related to what the participants wanted to learn more about in the area of health and well-being. And so we used a qualitative approach called affinity mapping, where we physically mapped out everyone's responses on the wall, and then we categorized them based on thematic groups. And through this approach, we co-created sharing circle topics, which were then integrated into our 3-month healthy living initiative. And these topics include stress management, goal setting, resistance training, and even nutrition. And so while participants took part in reaching their own physical activity goals throughout the week, we were also growing as a community by teaching and learning about the things they wanted to learn more about. And as the title suggests, with every step, we grow stronger. And that was sort of our motto. Another key thing to note is that the whole process of knowledge dissemination was fluid and it was reciprocal. The sharing circle topics were never set in stone, but they were actually constantly being refined by the community in our ongoing sharing circles. Again, the whole process of knowledge translation was driven by direct input by community members, and these teaching and learning moments reflect the 4 R's in respect, responsibility, relevance, and of course, reciprocity. And we see this from start to finish, from co-creation design to the co-creation of our sharing circle topics in our Healthy Living Initiative. And last but certainly not least, we wanted to make sure that this teaching and learning process was not only ethically sound, but also culturally safe. And as Gina and Georgia both articulated really well, cultural safety involves capacity building in a meaningful way. It was really important for our team to create and maintain meaningful relationships with the community so that these relationships are everlasting. And as an elder once taught me, it's really about the importance of doing things in a good way. And as I grow into my current role as a health promotion specialist at UBC, I've been thinking almost every day what it really means to do things in a good way. And at UBC and many post-secondary institutions across Canada, we talk a lot about JEDI work. And this means we are constantly thinking about social justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. When we work with communities to co-create physical activity programs, we really have to use an additional lens to evaluate whether our words and actions are culturally safe. And speaking from experience, when I'm part of programming, I always bring to the table and ask, hey, who are we excluding, rather than what just the evidence says? You know, for instance, knowledge translation messages like sit less, move more, they're everywhere. We hear it a lot, but you know, not everyone can sit less. We also hear a lot about do more, but for some folks, they've barely just started. So when we think about using evidence-based knowledge translation messages, we need to ask ourselves, who are we excluding? To summarize, in order to do things in a good way, we need to step back and kind of first think about how we can advance health and well-being for equity deserving groups, especially groups that have been historically, systemically, and persistently marginalized. And, as students and teachers, coaches, educators, practitioners, current and aspiring healthcare professionals, allies of Indigenous communities, we must recognize current practices that are culturally unsafe and shift towards evidence-based practices that acknowledge and value and really honor the voices of Indigenous communities. And these practices begin with something as simple as land acknowledgements. To summarize my portion of the presentation, generic physical activity guidelines should not be applied within Indigenous communities. What we need are culturally relevant and safe approaches, and these approaches require extensive community engagement. And this is the lifelong process of learning, relearning, and unlearning that is so fundamental to cultural humility. By using a community-based and Indigenous-led approach, programs can draw upon the traditional, historical, and cultural perspectives reflective of local teachings. And in doing so, we can empower Indigenous community leaders to be the key advocates of health behavior change within their own community. And that's all from me, folks. And I'll pass the torch to Dr. Rosalin, who will conclude this wonderful presentation with some key takeaways from our past and current work and how we can use our teaching and learning moments to build hope and, empower resilience and all the good work that we will continue to do in partnership and in friendship with our communities. So quick shim from Lytton First Nation. Haichigasiam from Musqueam and Miigwech to extend our thanks to our families and friends and allies from the East Coast, all our relations.
Kakshem, thank you, my allies, Henry Lai, Georgia Street, and Gina and Gavin. That was amazing. I just love your work. And I just, one of the biggest goals we have at UBC within Indigenous Studies and Kinesiology program is really building that awareness of how important that is with working within our Indigenous communities. So thank you for highlighting that and really putting a really phenomenal framework to knowledge translation. So Kakshem, thank you. I can go to the next slide. So I love seeing these photos. These are from Lytton First Nation. I'm Dr. Wilson Miles, and I'm a member of Lytton First Nation, and I'm based right now in the traditional unceded territory of the Musqueam people. In the photo here, I see Chief Jenna Webster and my auntie Judah and some of our youth. And as you know, Lytton has gone through a very difficult time. And right now, bringing people together and sharing our work with our community and with the youth is vital right now. So thank you for being part of this moment. And I'd like to share a video from Kamshina High School, where hearts combine.
Place to be, just struggles real, but it made me meet. I was fatherless for most of my youth, but my grandpa, he showed me the truth. I almost died, now my soul's awake. I'm here for a reason to show a way. We are not alone, we all feel the same. Let's come together, everybody sing. Changes, I'm feeling, I will fight it for my freedom. By the rivers, as the stars will shine, let's together. In a place where hearts combine. In a place where hearts combine.
Thank you so much. That gives you an idea of our youth. They're impassioned and they're empowered to be together right now. And so thank you so much for sharing that. It's so heartfelt. And our communities are growing, our communities are getting stronger. And so it's really important that when we focus on working with an Indigenous community that we co-create and we look at what the community is already doing really well from a strength-based perspective. And so it was an honor for me to work with our team, Indigenous Health and Wellness Research Program and our curriculum design. We are really dedicated to creating and implementing a culturally safe way to translate, harmonize, and share Indigenous health and wellness knowledge and ways of knowing. So we made sure we really were inclusive of elders and knowledge keepers. Through the process of co-creation design, I was really honored for our students to come to Lytton, and we engaged and we asked our community members what was important in creating physical activity, programming, or opportunities within the community. And some of our community voices said, this is a perceived loss of connection to traditional knowledge, therefore support for traditional health and wellness is needed. Indigenous communities are losing the connection to traditional sports, which is very true. In my community, we do boat and stick games, or called clubhouse. Hunting, fishing, gathering, harvesting, and hiking are traditional activities that embodies traditional health and learning from the land. We're learning about traditional foods and use of traditional plants, medicines. We learn about where we are from. So in Lytton, we have an abundance of natural resources. Right now, we're harvesting wild asparagus. We're harvesting Indian celery, Sueta. We have in July, August, we have Saskatoon berries. We're also harvesting morels right now. And in June, we'll be harvesting wild potatoes. So there's a really great way to live off the land right now in Lytton. And by doing that, you're actually walking quite far, and you're walking quite a few different elevations. And that's way more meaningful for our community to teach our language and to come together as families and do these traditional activities. So the following thoughts were voiced by our community members. There's strong support for elders to be program champions. There's strong support for elders only activities in healthy lifestyle behaviors, like was shared in a presentation yesterday. I loved, they had an elder talent show, which I thought that would be just so much fun. Elders can teach tips and tricks to youth and children, allowing for the international sharing of knowledge. So I've been learning lately, like for example, harvesting wild potatoes. I never knew how to do that before. And one of the things that's really important when you go to Botany Lake, where the potatoes are, there's one region that's selected for that year. So the whole lake you can harvest around the Botany, but there's only one section that's been designated for harvesting. That way, not all the roots are taken up and the plants will regenerate every year for seasons to come. There's a need to empower young champions and role models for community-based initiatives. So we have a lot of youth right now who are, especially when you're in a rural community, if you are having partnerships with elders or other youth leaders, it's really important to have that right now. Knowledge and curriculum development is really important. So when you create a course with regards to Indigenous health and wellness, it's really important that you're inclusive of different ways of knowing. So for example, elders and knowledge keepers must be included. We need to have this exchange of knowledge. We have knowledge that is based over 10 years of teachings. So it's really important that we include this within our curriculum for community-based learning. So the community-based learning builds on transferable life skills through traditional activities that empower youth to make self-determination goals towards health and wellness. And knowledge gained by our youth. Our youth right now are our most important resource right now in our community. We want them to build strong. And to do this, we have to really have strong ties to holistic health and wellness, physical, emotional, spiritual, and mental. So we want to engage Indigenous youth and elders, make sure it's community-based. We really want to be aware right now, especially right now, of the impacts of our residential schools and our healing that we need to do with our communities, that we have a holistic approach, that we're not just thinking emotional and mental, we're also including spiritual ways of healing, whether it's smudging or bringing in traditional healers. We need to practice healthy lifestyle behaviors, making sure you have enough sleep, make sure you eat well and drink lots of water, etc. Present day opportunities and aspirations of Indigenous health and wellness. So what are our aspirations, to be physically active? Traditional Indigenous health and wellness knowledge has to be grounded in those ways of knowing, plus community-based experiential learning. So those things have to be brought together. Thank you. So we had learning placements. So every year we have the Active Spirit Walk and Run. This year we're going to kick off our event on June 21st on Strava and on Facebook. And it's a way for people to come together nationally. We will return to having a walk and run in Musqueam. We really think our goal is to bring families together, to bring community together, and we're walking. So that part is really important. And we also invite UBC students to be part of the process to make it a lot of fun and a true engagement experience. We also were partners in the Rainforest Trail Run. It was a big honor to be part with Achilles Tendon, Doug Clement. We are always wanting to be inclusive of our community members and give back. This was an event that we held, should be happening again in September as well. So we really want to thank their support. We also like to recognize and that we value Indigenous knowledge for all our ways of knowing. So for example, we live at Musqueam, so we want to make sure wherever we are, we recognize the traditional teachings, the knowledge keepers and elders of wherever we are together. So it's important as a Lytton First Nation community member that I'm inclusive of Indigenous ways of knowing, that we create a culturally safe, respectful, and culturally sensitive environment, and that we honor all Indigenous voices, because with that way, we actually learn more. We hear different perspectives, and our goal for myself as a medical professional is to teach empathetic listening. So one of the things at the UBC, when we have people going into this field, we really want people to teach compassion, empathetic listening, and be inclusive, to reflect our own role and place within the community and how to respect and incorporate Indigenous knowledges, teachings, and values. Thank you. Great. Thank you for listening. I'm sorry for the background noise. We had there's some people doing work in my backyard. So thank you so much for this presentation and for being with us today. Do we have any questions?